So, hi, I'm Paul Delano. Welcome to the second morning session on the second or the final day, CenturyCon. I'm going to be talking about how to build complex solutions with rich interfaces at FICO. So, right. So, what's FICO? What am I going to be talking about today? So, first, I'm going to give you a little introduction to FICO and the CCS division and product division that this project was built in. I'm going to be talking about the project itself, going to details, a little bit of detail about how ExtJS really moved our project forward. Then I'm going to be talking about some of the interesting features, some widgets and interesting components we built using ExtJS. And then finally, I'm going to talk about some best practices, some techniques we use to really move our project along. And first of all, so I think something is maybe a little more unique about this presentation than a lot I've seen. I am going to be showing a little bit of code, but I'm also going to be talking about some best practices, some sort of more management stuff. So how many people are actually management types? All right, pretty good. So I got about almost a third are sort of managers. And then, so how many are developers? Okay, yeah, just about everyone's got developers too. Some development stuff too, good. So yeah, let's talk about FICO a little bit. So yes, this is the FICO. So leading analytics, particularly financial analytics company, although other kinds of analytics too. A lot of business lines now we support. You can go to MyFICO and get your FICO score. And but this is a division that is the CCS, so it's the Customer Communication Services. So a big part of what FICO does is they detect fraud. So the banks will send our high-capacity servers their transactions in real time. And what we do is, with the Falcon application, we kick out those potential fraud cases. So the question is, what do you do with those fraud cases when they turn up? Well, what you do is you pass them off to Customer Communication Services. And basically, what that is a platform where we very quickly and efficiently and automatically correspond with the bank's customers to let them know about the potential fraud and to get feedback whether that fraud actually existed. And in terms of who do we deal with, who are our customers, it's basically about half the cards you have in your wallet. That's about the kind of clients that FICO has right now and are using the CCS platform. So, and specifically, what's it all about? My wife about 3 months ago, she was just out and about. She got a call on her cell phone from an 800 number. She didn't pick it up. A couple hours later, when she got home, there in her email inbox was a message from her bank, basically saying, we detected a couple of transactions in a town that was about 30 miles away from where we live. And that was on the same day, actually within a few minutes of some transactions she had done at the local CVS. So that kicked out the transactions on the fraud system. Within minutes, again, they were contacting her. And when they couldn't get her on the phone, they contacted her via email. And so another one, so how many people have actually gotten a phone call or a message like this about a potential fraud? Wow, like about half of you. Okay, so this is a really big deal out there. And it's a really big deal because it's a very extremely timely thing. So minutes matter in terms of detecting these frauds. So how do we do this? So we have a very flexible platform. And our typical client is a bank, although, again, there's other industries that we now support. What is this platform all about? We're down on the bottom there. So on the platform, we have first we have integration. So we get transactions either from the FICO Falcon system or from the banks themselves. But the banks, if you know anything about banks, they're going to try to get you data from XML and green screens and flat files and all kinds of stuff. So we have to get all that data in. Then we have a bunch of rules. So it's a very flexible platform, and the banks are very demanding clients. So we're going to get transactions in we're going to get what we call cases or alerts in for Sometimes it's very simple stuff like you just got a new bank card and they want to notify their customers, or more urgent things like fraud. And then there's some subtleties to that, because we have to decide whether it's a high value fraud or a low value fraud. And so that kind of takes us to the third part, which is what we call the contact strategy. So if it's a low value fraud, or maybe just you got a new card, we're gonna text message your mobile phone. If we don't get you in an hour, maybe we're going to call your mobile phone. If we don't get you there, then maybe we're going to send you an email just to notify you got a new card. But if it's a high-value fraud case, what we're going to do is we're going to send you an SMS on your mobile phone. 5 minutes later, we're going to call you on your mobile phone. Still no response. 5 minutes later, we're calling you on your office phone. 5 minutes later, we're calling you on your home phone. Finally, at the end of that, we're going to send you an email. And then an hour later, if we don't hear anything, we're going to run the cycle all over again. So there's a lot of different options there. And what the business ran into is that in order to set these things up and update these things, it became a very complicated process. So your typical, our business analyst is talking to the client. They're going to generate pages of documentation about what kind of data is coming in, how they want it to be processed, what happens to all the special cases when things don't go as expected, or what happens when the client actually responds. If they press 0, how do we get to the operator? How do we get to the call center, et cetera? So typically, the analyst talks to the client, generates pages of documentation. That gets handed over the wall to technicians, who then start configuring the platform, which is a whole bunch of XML files and things like that. And then, of course, throughout the whole life cycle, there's this whole other issue of saying, well, you've got to update this thing. How do we go about doing that? It ended up becoming a very complicated cycle. So about 2 years ago now, the business decided and said, we really have to streamline this. We have to be competitive. We just have to give our clients a much better experience. We can't deliver this in months. We have to deliver this in days or weeks. And so what we did, and what they decided was, they said, we're going to create a project. We're going to create a new product called Designer, or CCS Designer. And what that is basically the scenario now transforms to say, now this analyst is going to sit down with a client in front of a screen, answer a few questions, click a button, and it's going to work. And that's, if you knew the old process, that is a very ambitious process. And to step back from this a little bit, what we did, and so basically what the business did, they said, okay, basically the beginning of 2014, they gathered a team together. And it was basically about 7 developers, a couple managers, a couple dedicated business people who really knew the business. And they brought us together, and they said, okay, this is what we want you to do. Implement this, okay? All right. And this is just, I'm going to leave this on the screen for a minute just so you get a feel for what it used to look like with all that crazy XML file stuff. So what they did, again, just this team had some challenges. So it was a very well-supported, really good team of people, but we had some challenges. First of all, it was disparate. So about a third of the team was in the U.S. and up in Connecticut, where I am from. About a third of the team was up in Canada, and a third of the team was in the U.K. So we had a lot of kind of remote issues to manage. The other thing was we also were bringing in some new technologies. So one of those being ExtJS, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But to again emphasize, this is what it used to look like. So it used to be, the cool thing back in the day was that you could use Visio to lay out these voice flows, where you could say, initially you've got a prompt coming in, and you got to play that prompt, and then they press 1, you do this, and press 2, you do that, press 0, you go to the operator. All that gets coded into these XML templates, and then you go from there. What we've done is that we've actually created these visual editors now. So this is a snapshot of a new visual flow editor. And so just to kind of give you a feel of how it looks now. All right, so when the team got together, we did a few different things. One of the things we did actually that's kind of neat was we said, well, who's our user in this case? And we said that analyst that's talking to the client, that's our user. We didn't have actually a good dedicated user to test the system or to query. So what we did is we made one up. So we created Bruce. So Bruce is our customer. Bruce is our user. Bruce is our analyst. And so I think it's a really great concept if you're ever building a project like this to say, get real clear about who your user is and like give them a personality. And then there was a constant conversation about, okay, well, what can Bruce do? What can't Bruce do? What does Bruce want to see? Bruce is sitting down with a client, sit in that room, sit with them. What do they want to see? What don't they want to see? Okay. So when the team also got together, we considered a lot of different architectural options. This thing's built on MongoDB, mostly due to just the data flexibility of that, and more than the scalability facets of Mongo. Java. We're a big Java shop, and we want to be able to provide a very scalable, maintainable solution. And then finally, ExtJS. So I could talk about the other decisions, why those choices, but let's talk about ExtJS just for a minute. So ExtJS has a lot of visual components. So we knew off the bat we wanted to use the grids. We had a lot of forms. We had a lot of interactive things that we needed to build that I'm going to talk about in detail. It's themable. So this is a big deal. FICO is turning all of their analytics solutions into a unified cloud platform, and all of them have to look the same. They have to have the same fonts, colors, logos, etc. And even the button styling and everything like that, we all want that to be the same. We love the object-orientedness of ExtJS. We're a Java shop. We want we love the encapsulation, everything. We love the extensibility. That was a huge win for us. And as part of that, it's extensible. Of course, MVC standards, and of course, at the end of the day, when we've got a deadline, we love that we can pick up the phone and get some answers if we have some problems. Okay. So just to sort of get to the nitty-gritty about the project, so about 9 months after we started, we delivered. So we delivered last September, and we've got new solutions are now built in Designer, and there's been some nice payoffs in that the interface we developed for Bruce is now being used by a whole bunch of Bruces out in the field, and they really love it because they actually can now take this out in front of clients, and it makes us look really good and very professional, and it makes Bruce look a lot smarter than he actually is, because he can just say, oh, well, of course I know what these are the options are, because that's what presented, and it's a whole lot easier for him to just select things rather than to make things from scratch in terms of these solutions. All right? Okay, so that's kind of an overview. And I'm really moving through this presentation. So if you see, I'm going to move through these slides. I've got a bunch of features to talk about. And so if there's anything that I'm going to leave some time, I want to leave some time at the end. So certainly, be ready to ask some questions then, because I'm going to move through this stuff fairly quickly. All right. So I'm going to talk about just some of the features we developed, and really, I think, and how ExtJS helped move those features along. I mentioned the FICO theme. So this was something, I'm more of a back-end developer, Java Enterprise, database, working up from the database up through the stack. And I've just been using a lot of ExtJS for the last few years. This is actually my 4th ExtJS project. And back to ExtJS 2 and 3, and now we're up to 4 and 5, and now 6 this week. And in any case, I was actually kind of surprised. I had not been that involved with the theming of ExtJS. And so one of the challenges also of this project was that the ExtJS, the FICO corporate design team was building an ExtJS theme. But it was not complete by the time we were going to start our project. So I had some real concerns about being able to drop in a fully theme with like extra widgets and everything in it, and be able to drop that halfway into the project. As it turns out, it worked. So about a third of the way into the project, about 2 months into the project, we already had screens up, we had some functionality up, we got the theme, and to my surprise, it actually worked. We just had some little tweaks here and there, but other than that, out of the box, if you're just real careful with how you create that theme, it just works. Okay, so the way we did it at FICO is basically the design team created a theme site. So they basically created a site. You can look, if you squint real hard, you can see that there's a whole bunch of different things. So there's styled grids and buttons, as well as some extra widgets and things like that they created. And then if you look at, this is just a typical screen in the current designer, and you can see the logo's the same, color's the same, menus are the same, and it just works really well. Okay. And I'm going to show a little bit of some of these other things in some of the other slides. Okay, so now there's 3 big components that we built for this that did not come out of the box. First of those was the wizard. So we want to make Bruce look really good when he's in front of the client, okay? And so what we want to do is basically say, okay, we're going to lead him along the golden path. We're going to say, okay, first of all, what country is this solution going to be in? What languages are they going to speak? And then what kind of cases are we going to get? Are they fraud cases or what have you? And how do we want to set that up at a high level? And so that ended up being like about a 50-step wizard. So how do you manage, and that's a simplification, of course, of hundreds of choices we've now distilled down into about 50 steps. And those are dependent steps too. So if they say if it's US, that's going to limit the number of languages we're going to let them select and things like that. So what we actually created was a multi-tier wizard. So you've got step-by-step across the top, and then you've got step-by-step down. Okay, so that makes that wizard kind of manageable. We break it up into chunks. And then the other piece of that is when that wizard was one of the first things we created because that's something we really wanted to show value to the business. Something I didn't really mention was that this was built as an agile project. So I'm also interested about there. So how many people are working on agile teams that are like 2-week sprint kind of things? Okay. About a third to half. Okay, great. So that also was, that's great. I really love Agile, but it also was due to the business where the business did not hand us good requirements, okay? So what we had to do was constantly be delivering value and to show them what was going on and to get their feedback along the way. But again, going back to the wizards, what we did was we actually took that original wizard that we kind of just built, and then we turned that into a component because we discovered later that we actually had some little mini wizards that we wanted to do. So we created a wizard component, and it was basically a card layout, very much like a tab layout, except that instead of tabs across the top, you end up with those wizard steps, okay? Okay, the other big piece, and perhaps the most complex and custom thing that we did was the voice flow, or the IVR flow editor. So you can see here's the top level view of it. You can see the small boxes there are basically modules. Each one of those modules is going to be composed of anywhere from maybe 5 to 50 sub-blocks that I'll show on the next page. And so basically we get this high level view that then drills down into this low-level view. When you drill down to this low-level view, now you're selecting, you can edit those boxes, so you can change the prompt to say, change just the different flow. If you have another option, you have press 1, press 2, now you need to press 3 to do something else. You can edit all of that in there. And what's interesting about this is, there's no ExtJS component at all to do this kind of stuff. Maybe in 6, I haven't heard about it yet. But so this is a very kind of custom, very complex kind of application that we basically needed to do in HTML. So we had our designers, do it in HTML. But what we did is we encapsulated it. We said we're going to make that kind of that's basically going to put that inside a component. And then when you click on things and open up a form, now you're popping out into ExtJS forms. So. Another couple things about that is JS Plum we use to draw the lines. So that's a nice open tool that worked really well for that. And so again, there's a lot of more detail on that, but I want to move it along. So the next thing here is the rule viewer. So this was case where, okay, Bruce. So the developers said that we're kind of pushing kind of hard to say, well, Bruce, he should be able to write a little code, right? Well, no. So they basically said, no, Bruce cannot write code at all. So we said, okay, we're going to make these rules. The way these rules are structured, they're pure if-then rules. So if this is true and this is true, then do this action and that action. And so that's basically the way we structured it. So it's a little hard to see here, but you've got, each line here is a rule. And you can, we did some visual styling, within each grid row here. We use some nice features like you can actually reorder the rules just by dragging and dropping and that sort of thing. And then when you actually go and edit a rule, it's all selectable. And so this was something I think that just the ExtJS component architecture really helped again, because what we can say is each condition becomes a little component. And now if you've got one condition or 10 conditions, we're just popping in additional components inside that layout. And the layout gets very tricky here too, because some of these fields can actually change size and things like that. And so the ExtJS layout model really helped a lot with that. Okay, so those were the three big the kind of the three big components that we built in Designer. There were some smaller, nice little design patterns also we developed. So one of those we call resettable fields or resettable form fields. And basically what that looks like is, in some scenarios, for example, when you're those what we call strategies, where you're actually getting that sequence of how you contact people. What that looks like is when you have a strategy, you always have a default strategy. And maybe the default strategy is you're waiting 1 hour between contacting the person. And so when you have another strategy, maybe an aggressive strategy, you want to change that time out to maybe 5 minutes. And so for Bruce, it's kind of hard. How do you denote in a form, what's the value, and how do you know if that's an override value or a default value? And this took some discussion. Finally, we settled on this, which seems to work pretty well, and Bruce seems to understand this. So in this particular example, what you would do is when you come into this form, the default value would be zip code. So you would have zip code selected, and then if you clicked on social security number, this little badge comes up here. So now that basically denotes that this is a custom override of the field. And then if you click on that custom badge, it's going to pop up this confirmation form to let you reset it back to the default. And in that case, what happens is this badge disappears and the value goes back to the default. So this is something just a little bit of a complex user interface concept that we're able to implement pretty simply inside the user interface. Okay, another neat little thing we added was an audio player. So as part of the voice modules, we also wanted to have them play the prompts, because sometimes they have to, these are actually recorded prompts. So there's actually people in studios recording these prompts to say, please try again and all that stuff. And sometimes they just get it wrong. So what we let them do is now, you're not going to get this in Visio, right? So we make this fully interactive. So if you're looking at the prompt text, you can play the prompt text and say if it's correct. And so once again, no audio component in ExtJS right now. I think it's probably because it's an HTML5 only feature. And but in our space, generally that's okay for our users, for Bruce. And so basically what we did is we just created a little component for that. So basically there's a little HTML5 audio tag that sits in the page that lives inside an ExtJS component. And then there's those inline controls can get inserted into the text with a simple function call. So when you render it out, you just insert that in. And then that's fully interactive too. So when you press the play button, the icon this little font icon that changes into a little pause or stop button that you can then stop the prompt playing if you want interactively. Okay, another big challenge that we had was document generation. So Bruce is going to sit with a client. They're going to go through the wizard. They're going to configure the rules a little bit. But at the end of the day, they have to be able to push a button and generate the documentation. And we had some debate about that. There are some packages in Java that let you create PDFs and stuff like that. But finally, we said, well, what if we just did a bunch of screenshots? And that's actually the approach we used. And you can see, this is an example of actually PDFs that are generated. You can see on the right-hand side, that's another voice flow that looks pretty much like the voice flow screenshot I had before. And once again, I had some concerns about that, but we were able to manage that pretty well. And we were able to do that, first of all, by finding this Phantom JS tool. So basically, that's a JavaScript-based, it's an open tool. It lets you screen capture screens in a very configurable way. And at the end of the day, what we delivered was pretty good because it's WYSIWYG. So Bruce is going in and editing things, and then the documentation he gets out in the end looks very much like that. And that's great. So now he can navigate the content in kind of a known way. One thing about this Phantom JS is, well, there's two other tricks if you're going to do this kind of thing. One is what we do in the in the layout is we just basically have a hidden flag behind the scenes where when we're rendering the page, we can always tell whether it's the printable view or the interactive view. So if it's printable view, we can hide the save button and that sort of thing. The other trick is, if you're doing this kind of thing, is ExtJS is loading, it's not rendering instantaneously, right? It's loading value into stores to populate the grids and things like that. So if you snapshot the page immediately, all your grids are going to be blank. So there's a callback. There's a callback mechanism in Phantom.js where you can say, okay, stores are loaded, pages are rendered. You can detect that pretty easily, and then you can just call back to Phantom.js. So that was something, again, that was not working for us for a while, but then we found that, and it works pretty magically. Okay, so now here's something that I developed and I thought was pretty innovative, and now is being basically preempted by the Sencha inspector. So if you're dealing with a lot of data inside your applications, you're going to deal with stores, right? You've got all these stores, and in this application, we have literally about maybe 40 stores. So there's a lot of data moving around and used in different ways. And the problem is when you're debugging things, sometimes you'll load up the data into a combo box, for example, and that combo box is empty. And why is it empty? On the server, it's serving up the data. I can see it actually coming across the wire, but the combo box is still empty. Maybe it's a combo configuration or whatever. So just to kind of narrow down the possibilities, here was a way to basically look. What this does is you can actually introspect into the ExtJS store mechanism inside the application. And what this does is this just gives you the list of stores, tells you how many records are in the store, tells you what type of store it is. So you can actually maintain that too. And you can say, well, what's this store? Oh, that's some legacy thing, some code that we forgot to delete. Okay, well, there's something to clean up. And then once you click on a store, you can actually view all the data too. And again, this is a very simple kind of interface where it's just throwing it into a table. But we also added capability to like clear the filters, because sometimes that messes you up. There's an unexpected filter still on the store, as well as force a reload of the store and that sort of thing. So you can kind of give that low-level manipulation of the store that can be pretty handy for debugging. Okay, so now to the management side of things a little bit. Okay, so first thing, I'm going to talk about just some high-level stuff about managing projects, and then some rights and wrongs in terms of coding and loading inside ExtJS. Okay, so first of all, so this is a lot of stuff on here that if you're managing, just stuff to think about. First of all, plan for success. Okay, so if you're doing an ExtJS project, it's a big framework. It's a really big framework, and it changes, and it gets better, and it gets updated. And the thing is, there is a right way to do things, and there are wrong ways to do things. And if you go online, there's lots of tutorials that are great. And before you I hate to say it, but before you touch a lot of the code, look at those tutorials. Really look at that, because there's really some structured ways to do things. And so if you plan for that, if you realize that, plan for that. And a couple of things you can do aside from just going online and looking and reading and getting up to speed is, get an expert. So start out at least, I was actually the expert on this team. I was brought in because I had done a couple ExtJS projects before, and there was one other person. So, we were able to really get things going in the right directions, which is really important at the beginning. Get training, that really helps too. Once you get going, it's important to manage the learning curve, because there's a lot of components. So, I went in and implemented the rules piece. Okay, well, I learned a lot of stuff about how to nest components together and get them to, if the page resizes, have it look right and things like that. And well, gosh, you need those similar design patterns over in the voice editor, because there's actually some rules inside the voice and things like that. So it's important. What we do is actually every 2 weeks we have what we call the ExtJS forum. So it's basically an hour we set aside for the whole development team, and we basically talk about what's going on. And sometimes we cancel it because there's not much going on or nothing new, but very often, I would say 9 times out of 10, we're there and there's something new, and something new to learn and pick up, and and just figure out the best practice and stuff like that. Another thing that just helps is code review. So we're an agile team. Before any of the code gets delivered to QA, we do code review. We do that for security primarily, but it's also been a big win in terms of just making sure that the new guy coding stuff isn't going off in some weird direction, and then the new guy can actually review kind of the expert's code to see how things are done. Another thing is ExtJS has a lot of really powerful components that, like, out of the box, you can do amazing things. You can just pop out a grid, put some data into it, and it looks amazing. It's really tempting at that point sometimes to just hand off, you've got a new feature to create, to just hand it off to developer and say, okay, I want a grid with a couple buttons on the top, go for it. That can work, but to save yourself some time, lay out the page first, because there's always design choices. Even when you have these powerful visual tools, be able to, really run it by the business users first before you start coding. And then finally, kind of like any project, managing technical debt, how does that apply to ExtJS? Typically, it's like cleaning up your views and stores. So sometimes views can get unwieldy. Kind of like the wizard case where you had this kind of monolithic wizard, and then we turn it into components, and then we reuse those components. So we try to allocate some time for that. And then again, like consolidating components. Okay, so I'm a team lead on this project, but I'm also very hands-on, and I get very strong opinions about how to do things right and how to do things wrong. And like I said, there's lots of tutorials. You can go online and do things right, but very often, and these things I'm talking about doing it wrong, that's because we've done these things, okay? And as my compatriots in the UK would say, it's not all rainbows and unicorns out there. So these are some of the things we have actually run into. One of those is to do it wrong, initializing everything in the DOM. Document object module, particularly if you're used to other frameworks that I won't mention here. Like, it's all about the DOM. You've got this div over here. I want to style it. Okay, I'm going to select that div and I'm going to style it, and I'm going to build my whole page inside that div after it's been rendered. Okay, and the whole page is going to go bloop, bloop, bloop when it loads and what have you. Okay, wrong. Don't do that. Okay, and then what I also did on these slides, I've got 4 slides here. After each one, I've also and again, this is for managers. Okay, so if you want to know if your team is doing this wrong, look in the sub-bullets, okay? So if the after list, and you don't even have to understand the code, just ask your coders to take you here and say, oh, let me look at the after render listener, okay? Now let me look at the init component method, okay? If the after render listener is bigger than the init component, there may be something wrong, okay? And those coders, I'm sure, understand that. Those coders don't understand it, but that's okay. All right, so again, that's something we ran into and had to rewrite some of the code because it was wrong, and it was like impossible to read or maintain, and we had to rebuild it to do it the right way. The next part is, if you want to do it wrong, just mix your views and controllers. Okay, you've got all this stuff going on the screen. Just put it in one big file. Okay, don't do that. Break it out. There's again some good architectural tutorials that Sencha has online that kind of takes you through how to break that stuff up and turn things into components and things. Good stuff. Finally, on this one, and this is one I'm actually kind of guilty of, is make your code really dependent on the structure. Okay, so you've got a button, or you've got a radio button here, and when you click on that radio button, you want a text box to show up underneath it. Good responsive kind of stuff. Good idea. Well, but when you make that action happen, don't be so dependent on the structure. Don't go up a level and then down 2 levels and the second one across, and that's where the event occurs. Okay, there's XQuery and things like that make that much cleaner. Okay, so let's talk about how to do it right. So first of all, name components consistently. So you're dealing with a user. You should have a user model that's like your user object, your user store that's storing your users, your view user that lets you view your user, maybe an edit user view to edit the user. Just real nice, simple naming consistency goes a long way. Use routing. Okay, so this is something where, and actually here's another quick little survey. So how many people are on the web side? Okay. How many people are on the mobile side of things? Okay. So a little bit of each. On the website, how many people don't use routing? Okay. Look into it. So this is something we set up. I actually wasn't so familiar with this coming into this project, and this is something we set up early that's really nice. It's a component. It's now a standard part of ExtJS. I think it used to be an extension. Basically, what it lets you do is set up inside the URL, inside the browser, how you're accessing and navigating within your one-page application. Really handy. If nothing else, it's a great experience for Bruce because he can hit forward and back on his browser, and it actually does what he expects. Okay, it actually takes him forward and back in terms of the workflow that he's been doing. All right, and then finally, use Sencha command. So this is really becoming an essential part of it. You can certainly set up small ExtJS applications without it, but if you're going to deploy it and things like that, you definitely want to set that up. It takes a little bit of time, even though I think it's been improved a lot over the years. But once you set it up, it's really great. It checks your code, it validates your code, it structures things, it compresses things. It's good stuff. All right, to finish things up, let's talk about 3 ways to load it wrong. ExtJS is a big framework. There's a lot of data moving around. So first of all, don't declare dependencies. So it's object-oriented. You've got a component. It's dependent on other components. Make sure you declare that because things may work, but they may break later on. If you're seeing errors on the console, that's always something to be nervous about. Those should be cleaned up because sometimes those errors on the console on one page will actually break another page. So you want to watch for that. Another thing is when something that happens, would happen to us quite a bit is you're loading a bunch of data into a screen. There's different components on the screen actually using the same pieces of data or what have you, and you making redundant store loads. So you're loading twice, 2-3 times within a page load. Don't do that, and that's just being very careful about how you're doing loading those calls. And then finally, just load up all your data at once. Break it down. Like I said, in our application, we had something on the order of 40 to 50 stores. So we broke it down into little pieces. What's nice is ExtJS lets you manage that very cleanly. So you can say, you just say this page or this view is dependent on this store, and then everything's just kind of loaded appropriately. Okay, and now 3 ways to load it right. So one is REST-based stores. So there's a bunch of different ways to set up stores. If you just make them REST-based stores, they pretty much work. So you can read the data, and then when you now want to update the data, you just update the store, and it takes care of persisting it to the server side automatically. It's a really, really nice way to do it, way to structure it. Another thing is the models. So the model is basically, from the Java world, you've got your Java objects representing your data. It's beautiful. In ExtJS, you have models. So now you just want basically a one-to-one correspondence between your objects and models. Really, really nice and consistent. And the little code there is actually a little snippet that helps you make Booleans the same on either side. And then finally, the isLoaded status. This is a little trick, again, we use to make sure that you're only loading data once. So you can always query a store to find out if the data's there. And then if you need to force a refresh of the data, you set that to false. And again, that's something I could go into detail about, but there's a pattern there that you can use to just help make sure that your data is fresh and maintained. Okay, so I just took you through a lot of slides. Thanks for hanging with me. And I just want to say, to conclude, I consider this a great success. I think this was a project, like I said, this is about my 4th ExtJS project in different business domains. And we built a lot of complex components. And it's a success. I think it's exceeded expectations, and now it's a model for other FICO projects. Recently, FICO has made a kind of a corporate push to be using ExtJS, so this is kind of a prototypical version application, a successful application. And then I would just summarize in terms of success with ExtJS, again, from a kind of a holistic level, I would say, plan ahead. get the initial training you need, get the expertise you need, set up your directories and things like that properly, and then take some time to manage the learning curve, and then finally just do it the right way. Learn the right way, and then just go and do it that way. So that's pretty much what I've got. So feel free to reach out and talk to me if you've got any questions. So I think we've got some time for questions. I don't see a clock here, but so yeah, any questions on what you've seen or whatever?
Yeah, as far as your memory of how you, as far as like your roadmap on how you develop the app, do you start with the back-end stores first and then work to the UI, or do you kind of scaffold a UI first just to kind of like mock where everything's going to lay, and then you like insert some test data, and then over time you plug in real data?
That's a good question. This project particularly was kind of simultaneously both. But I think the important point there is we paid a lot of attention to both sides of it. So it was a very data-driven application, because at the end of the day, what Bruce is configuring is a lot of stuff. And that's a very complex set of data that then needs ultimately rendered out to a whole bunch of files. So the data was very complex, hard to understand, a lot of business knowledge built into that. So that we had to take that very seriously, and that was below there. But we also had a very serious user interface challenge, in the sense that, and we ran into this sort of all the time. We said, well, if we think about it this way, we come up from the bottom, we say, well, write some code, and that's how you configure it. But we took the business side very seriously. We said, no, you can't do that. You have to create some kind of visual concept for how we're going to represent rules. And so we took the time, we mocked it up. We had dedicated design resources that would mock up every important screen. And in the end, we had to bring it all together. So in this case, it was really both. Yeah.
Can you go back over the WYSIWYG editor and what different technologies you looked at in order to build it? And I know you used the JS Plum.
Okay.
That part of it was really fascinating to me, how you were able to build the drag and drop, and what different technology options are out there. Could you have done it all in Sencha, or you had to go do a lot of it in jQuery?
Well, you asked about a lot of different pieces, and
I'm more focused on just the UI editor.
The voice flow editor, kind of
yes.
Near the beginning. Okay, so the voice flow editor. So, yeah. So if ExtJS had a flow editor, we would have used that. If we could have used that. So it took some doing to figure out what the best options were for that, and it was really saying, well, we know we're working within an ExtJS framework, and so it was encapsulating that. But ultimately, in terms of how we render those boxes on the screen and stuff like that, the solution was HTML, and so that's what we did. And we used, we just had to look out, and we did a lot of looking around. We always look around first for components that we can use, and we did find JS Plum, which connected lines together very nicely. But all I can say is, yeah, you got to go look, and it changes. I mean, there were some times, so kind of at the beginning of the project, we said, well, there's no answer or no good answer, but then 6 months later, there's an answer that comes up. So it's a moving target. Yeah.
What development style did you guys use for this project? The behavior-driven development, test-driven development, waterfall?
Well, we used Agile, or an adapted version of Agile. We do 2-week sprints. We and part of that is generating the backlog. So another thing that I didn't really mention is, so we had a diverse team, sort of multi-continent, multi-country team. At the beginning of it, basically, and then every quarter, we would get the whole team together in one place, first of all. So we would get everyone in a room. So at a very conceptual level, everyone was on the same page. And I think that was important, particularly that first meeting, to sort of level set and say, look, at the end of the day, this is important. And prioritize things. So that voice, the visual editor we're just talking about, initially that was done as a view-only solution. So we can say, okay, well, just to prove out, can we actually do this? Because this was it was a big development, and it was a big risk to say, can we even take this on? I mean, this is like re-implementing Visio, and there are companies out there that actually have professional products that they've spent like years on to do very similar sorts of things. So it was a lot of choices there. So I would say it was a matter of just continuous prioritization and focus on agile delivery. And we deliver, break it into chunks that we can deliver.
So there wasn't any variation, well, I mean, general variation as you developed the project of, somebody like feature creep, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, that didn't happen like throughout the project. I mean, everything was fleshed out from beginning to end.
Oh, no. I mean, it was a matter of coming up with priorities. And as a matter of fact, there's still pieces that we haven't implemented yet. Like there are actually certain files that get configured we haven't even touched yet, but yet we generate templates for them. And so it's been a very interactive. So we have a business owner or a project owner on the business side. He's not in the project, he's the owner, so he ultimately makes the decision in the prioritization. Yet, there's certainly a lot of features that will come out of the development team also. But ultimately it's his decision to say, well, that's a great feature. 6 months from now, that's going to be great. Right now, we need multilingual support, something like that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yep, back in the corner.
I have a question about the theming that you said that came in about 2 months into the project.
Yeah.
Are the designers you're talking about the UX designers, or are these knowledgeable in ExtJS? Who was building the theme?
These were people I did not work with directly. Like I said, it was another team. It was a FICO design team. I believe they may have actually kind of gotten a consultant in for at least part of it. So I think on staff we've got a FICO design team that sets the basic fonts and things like that, colors and what have you, and styles. And then I believe there was a consultant brought in or consultants brought in to actually implement that fully in ExtJS.
Okay, the reason I ask is because when you're building custom components, that's typically the development team. That's you mentioned a few like the Wizard.
Right.
So we do a lot of that, and then again in an agile environment, getting all that
Yep.
seamlessly work 2 months down into the cycle. You have to have people who are designing these themes that are also knowledgeable about what you're building.
Right.
So we are obviously just starting out with ExtJS, so we're not very knowledgeable on that. But is that any challenge you faced, or was that pretty seamless?
In terms of a challenge, in terms of like the design team build something and making it compliant, or?
And making it work, or is there an extra sprint just to get things to, the functional stuff that was working, like you said,
Right.
and getting it themed and still working, or did the dev had to do some rework?
Well, like I said, it was a pleasant surprise for me to say that the theme pretty much dropped in. Now, what we did, the design team was the development team was fairly careful to say, we're not gonna go be designing our own buttons and stuff like that. We're gonna use stock buttons, stock grids, at least to start before we get the themes in, so we're not going off in any direction. So we start out stock. When the theme came in, like I said, it pretty much, if there was a button there, it styled it. Now, there was a little bit of a transfer to say, okay, well, but that design team also added this concept of badges that I was showing. There were some different button styles and things like that we had to spend some time to use, and just the sizes of some of the titles and breadcrumbs and stuff like that had to be tweaked, but it was reasonably straightforward.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Anything else over here?
Could you talk on your testing infrastructure, what you possibly use for unit testing and end-to-end testing?
Sure. So at the end of the day, there's kind of 2 kinds of testing we were focused on. One was user interface testing. So we have set up Selenium tests, and we have spent quite a bit of time getting those implemented and supported. In terms of, there's a whole also, we built a whole other infrastructure for what we call acceptance tests, basically. At the end of the day, Bruce is going and configuring these solutions. generating potentially up to hundreds of files. Those files have to be right, because then those get put over to production servers to implement. So I would say, in general, there's 2 levels. So we did do a whole separate, user interface experience. So at least we have reproducible verification of that. And then we have a whole other layer on the kind of the back end in terms of the, the outputs of what, inputs and outputs of what we generate. All right. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you very much.